Orcs must die.
Hey there everybody, Handled Raptor here. Hope you're all having a fantastic day. Let's get into it. Hello there ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's video. Today we're going to be covering Orcs Must Die 3. This game is a tower defense, real-time strategy, and third-person shooter game. Now this game can be played either single player or co-op, however each person is going to have to own the game themselves on a separate console or PC. It is available for the PlayStation 4 and 5, Xbox One, Series S and X, as well as PC and Stadia, where it was exclusive for over a year. Let's start off with the game's overarching story. It takes place 20 years after the ending of Orcs Must Die 2, where Maximilian, the hero of the first two games, is missing. Gabriella, once the villain of the story in the first game, who's redeemed in the second, is now teaching students in place of Max and his master Cygnus. The two students who are being trained by Gabriella, Egan and Kelsey, are tasked with defending rifts, which are how magic flows into their world. Throughout the game, it becomes apparent someone or something is making more rifts and more orcs appear. As the game progresses, you learn that Vorwick, a friend of Master Cygnus over 100 years ago, slowly became more and more engulfed in his desire to control the orcs. Then, Vorwick reappears, morphed into a magical being after spending many years in the rifts of magic, hell-bent on revenge against Cygnus and the Order. Now onto the combat. Since it's a tower defense game, you're able to bring in traps that you can set up before the waves begin. The grid system itself makes it very easy to place your traps right next to each other. Some traps have the ability to amplify the damage or effects of other traps. For example, the tar traps, they slow enemies, obviously, but they have two upgrades. One makes them slowed after they even leave the tar trap, so it's a persisting effect. The second one makes it so that way while they're inside of the tar trap, they take increased fire damage. My absolute favorite combination is easily the ceiling traps, tar traps, and the barricades. Since this is also a third-person shooter, there are a multitude of different weapons to choose from, both melee and ranged. You can go anywhere from a hammer, to a bladed staff, to daggers, to a blunderbuss, which is basically a shotgun, to a magic bow. My favorite combination was easily the Ice Amulet, because it allowed you to freeze larger targets such as trolls or ogres, and then you can easily line up headshots with your main weapon, which for me was the blunderbuss. Each pellet that is fired from this weapon has its own damage value, so when you have a frozen target and you're able to shoot the heads on ogres or trolls like I said, it just absolutely increases the damage and you can just delete these guys. The visual effects are decent enough for traps. Nothing ever really stood out. The most extensive trap visually had to either be the flip traps, the large ones from the war scenarios, because they could just chuck a lot of guys, say off bridges or just straight up into the air to slow down their advance, or the saw blade launcher, which would fire off saw blades, but instead of just hitting and sticking to targets and doing damage, they actually just keep on going, and their trajectory changes whenever they hit anything else that you've built, saw blades or enemies, so they're just bouncing all over the place. The enemies were varied enough to present some challenges the further you progressed into the game, what with some specifically targeting barricades, that way they could ruin your whole maze of death, whereas some would just hop straight over them and come directly for you. While technically only having two factions, the Devils and the Orcs, the enemy type in each faction is very similar to the opposite faction, with slight differences. An example of this would be how the Earth Elementals, which would come from the Orcs rifts, they would have one large form that when broken would then spawn two medium forms, similar to the Heavy Orcs, whereas the big one would be more similar to Trolls or Ogres. And on the death of the second smaller versions, closer to the Heavy Orcs, they would explode and split into two different slightly faster ones. They're more similar to, say, the kobolds or the light orcs, so that way they would try and get past you just with the added benefit of making more and more versions of themselves. The devil equivalent, the fire elemental, only has two forms. The first is similar to the heavy orc, whereas when it dies, it becomes 4 or 5 smaller kobold-like fire elementals which run incredibly fast, and when they die, so if your traps kill them, they will then explode into damage to barricades and traps and everything else that they're around, which would be just two slight differences between the fire elemental and the earth elemental. Having similar types of enemies aside, the enemy types never really felt lazy or overused, because when you're facing a horde game that is involved in a tower defense, you never really feel like each one has to be special. You're just going through cannon fodder, and every once in a while you'll get faced with something that's a little bit harder. There was enough variation to make each map feel like it was under attack by certain squadrons of enemies. And speaking of the maps, each one feels like a different approach was made to allow the player to mix and match trap types and try out different playstyles. I'm sure you've probably noticed my playstyle, which is more of a death from above maze type. Just something about frickin' lasers coming out of the frickin' ceiling just feels so awesome. Alright, I'm sure some of you would like to get on with your day, so I'll go ahead and finish up. The game was a very fun puzzle shooter game for me, trying to figure out the most efficient spot and optimal placement for traps make my brain actually work, which is pretty good. The varied traps and weapons add for a ton of replayability, as well as the fact that there's an endless mode, so if you really want to test your skill and, well, maybe how much of a masochist you are, you can go in there and see how long you can last against a real, never-ending horde. Now, I obviously enjoyed this game, some parts more than others, namely the more lasers I had coming from the ceiling, the more fun I was having, but the amount of thinking and attention I had to pay to succeed was also something I really appreciated. One of those players who always has something happening on another screen, whether it's TV or music. This game didn't require my full attention, it just grabbed it and held on the whole time. I'm going to go ahead and give this game a solid 9 out of 10. Its worst scenarios allowed you to create massive fields of death, or just simply hire a bunch of archers to kill everything coming at you, let you really decide how you wanted the game to be played. The only reason I deducted a point is simply because of the story. Now, while the story was fine on its own, it's something you'd really expect from a mobile version of Orcs Must Die, and I realize that that's not really something that draws people in. You're not here to play Orcs Must Die for the story, but that doesn't mean that it should be, substandard. Thank you everyone for joining. Please, if you'd like to support us here at Gamer Critical Network, like, comment, and subscribe, and we hope to see you next time. Have a good one.